Good afternoon, and welcome to today's event on reforming student loan repayment. I'm Shia Cabas. I direct the Economic Policy Project here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. The economic consequences of COVID-19 have renewed conversations about the struggles of student loan borrowers. But it's important for us to remember that even prior to the pandemic, roughly 2 out of 5 outstanding loans expected to be in repayment in the federally managed portfolio were either delinquent or in default. And 20% of all borrowers were in default. Black borrowers face the brunt of this crisis, having more student debt on average and higher rates of delinquency and default. Income-driven repayment plans, which tie a borrower's student loan payment to a percentage of their income, are meant to offer borrowers relief, but uptake is lower than it should be. The confusing array of plans, as well as the burdensome application and verification requirements, depress enrollment. At the moment, interest accruals and payments on federal loans remain suspended until September 30th. But many of the 43 million Americans carrying student loan debt will struggle to meet their loan obligations when repayment resumes. Today's event is going to discuss how to reform the student loan repayment process to better support borrowers and improve loan outcomes. We've got a wonderful group of experts here with us today, but before we get to our panel, it's my honor to introduce some pre-recorded keynote remarks from Senator Marco Rubio. The senator has been a strong advocate for reforming the student loan program. He has advanced a number of bills to update loan repayment and better address the needs of modern borrowers. His most recent piece of legislation, the Loan Act, would reform the process by eliminating interest and replacing it with a one-time, non-compounding financing fee that borrowers would pay over the life of the loan. He's going to talk a little bit more about that right now, and we'll listen to the senator's remarks.
Hello, this is U.S. Senator Marco Rubio, and I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to address our nation's growing student debt crisis. The need to act now is great, and I'm pleased that the Bipartisan Policy Center has convened a discussion about durable reforms to improve the repayment process and improve outcomes while supporting borrowers. Look, I'm someone who dealt with his fair share of student loans, both as an undergraduate and as a law student, so I personally understand the financial difficulties of those what seem to be never-ending monthly payments and what that can pose, the challenge that poses. But I also understand the inherent unfairness in asking a bartender or small business owner to pay off those loans, which is what is being proposed by those who support automatic loan forgiveness en masse. Most importantly, blanket forgiveness is fundamentally backwards-looking, doing nothing. It does nothing to address future needs for borrowers. So we need to take steps to revamp our broken federal direct student loan system for the future, which is exactly what my Loan Act would do. My bill would reform our federal direct student loan system by eliminating interest and replacing it with a one-time, non-compounding financing fee to be paid out over the life of the loan. The bill would also place borrowers in an income-based repayment plan, ensuring that working-class Americans aren't further burdened with monthly repayments that they simply can't afford. The Loan Act would increase equity in lending, not only through the elimination of interest rates, but also by taking the unique financial circumstances of the borrower into consideration. So I look forward to continuing to work with BPC and other policy experts on measures to support student borrowers and our nation's economic future. Thank you.
We want to thank the senator again for his time and dedication to this important issue. And with that, we're going to move on to our expert panel. I'm going to pass the baton over to today's moderator, Michael Stratford. As many of you probably know, Michael's an education reporter for Politico. He did a terrific job moderating an event for us pre-COVID, so we've asked him back. Michael, thanks for joining us, and take it away.
Thanks, Shai. Thanks for having me, and I'm looking forward to our discussion today. Let me introduce our panelists. First, we have Beth Akers, who is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, who focuses on the economics of higher education. Sarah Saddlemeyer is the project director for education, opportunity, and mobility in the Higher Education Initiative at New America. Kat Welbeck is the deputy director of advocacy and the Civil Rights Council at the Student Borrower Protection Center. And Scott Buchanan is the executive director of the Student Loan Servicing Alliance. Thanks all for you being here. Looking forward to the conversation. I guess I would say that we are really at an unprecedented, I think, inflection point for the federal government's nearly $1.6 trillion portfolio of student loans owed by some 45 million Americans. So I'm looking forward to talking about where we are now, what needs to happen in the next few months as student loan payments potentially restart, and then get to the broader issue of ways that the student loan system in general need to be changed or reformed. Some of the ideas you heard a minute ago from Senator Rubio. I want to remind our viewers that you can submit questions to our panel using the live chat function on either YouTube or Facebook, or on Twitter using the hashtag BPCLive. And we'll have a conversation for a few minutes here, and then start to take some audience questions. I guess I'll start just by sort of setting the stage for where we are now in terms of the student loan repayment situation. I think of this as somewhat of a separate track from the very hot political debate happening right now over student loan debt cancellation and free college. I'm sure, as everyone listening knows, the Biden administration is considering proposals to cancel student loan debt and has already proposed large increases in federal spending on student aid, increasing the Pell Grant, setting up a new federal partnership that would subsidize tuition at community colleges. All of those are aimed at reducing the amount of debt students have to take on to pursue higher education going forward. But I think regardless of how those political fights shake out, we're still going to have some amount of student loan debt. Borrowers are going to still have the experience of having to navigate the repayment of that debt. And I think dealing with those issues is really what our focus today is. Most people will remember that more than a year ago, as the pandemic started in the US, in March 2020, the Trump administration exercised its executive powers to suspend the accrual of interest on federally held student loans and halt the involuntary collection of federally held student loans. President Trump announced it on March 13th, 2020, the same day he declared a national emergency because of the coronavirus pandemic. A few weeks later, Congress passed the CARES Act, which essentially codified those executive actions into law, but also went further in requiring the Education Department to automatically pause payments on all federally held student loans and continue to have the interest rate set at zero. That CARES Act relief for student loan borrowers was set to expire at the end of last summer, but the Trump administration, through two executive actions, extended the relief until the early days of the Biden administration. And then President Biden, on his first day in office on January 20th, took executive action to extend the relief yet again, extending it through at least the end of September. And at that point, student loan payments will have been on pause for roughly 18 months. The administration has said that it's looking at the possibility of extending that relief. Education Secretary Miguel Cardona suggested last week that he was looking at it, but also that it seemed to suggest that it was unlikely. To be precise, his quote was, a further extension, quote, is not out of the question, but at this point, it's September 30th. So I guess I want to talk about ways that people think we should turn on the student loan system, but I first want to hear from folks about whether we should turn on payments starting this fall. Sarah, I want to start with you. You've done some work on how borrowers are thinking about their student loans during the pandemic. Is September 30th the right time to start turning on monthly payments?
It's a really great question. Given the hardships and the repayment concerns that have been swirling around, policymakers may decide to extend the current emergency student loan benefits. But I think the most important thing to keep in mind is whether or not that payment pause is extended. There are some really important proactive actions that the department needs to be taking now just to make sure that there's a smooth path for borrowers to re-enter.
Kat, what's your take on whether student loan payments should restart this fall? I think some Democrats previously proposed doing a little bit of both, allowing payments to continue or allowing payments to restart, but continuing the 0% interest for some period of time into the future, maybe through some type of automatic trigger tied to an economic figure. I think some college groups have proposed that as well. What's your sense of whether it would be a good idea to start repayment this fall?
I mean, I'm gonna start just by saying, just echoing a little bit of what Shai said in his opening remarks, is just really thinking about how much the pandemic has laid bare, how many millions of Americans were struggling before the pandemic and even are struggling now. And I just think before we think to turn on student loan payments, we really need to think about, are we doing the things to fix the system to make sure that when we turn on payments that borrowers are not going to be in default 9 months later, to make sure that borrowers are actually able to make their payments, because we see that many people are still haven't fully recovered, and the payment pause has really provided some sort of relief to borrowers in this situation. I think there's some programmatic fixes that I think really need to be taken into consideration before we even talk about turning on payments. And I know we're going to get into that a little bit during the panel, so I'll just keep it short here, but would really love to dive into that a little bit later.
Yeah, you mentioned the relief that borrowers are receiving. The Education Department has said that the interest rate waiver alone is about $5 billion each month in interest that student loan borrowers have not been having to make throughout the pandemic and into at least September. Beth, what is your take on when student loan payments should restart?
Well, we know that the economy has not fully recovered. In fact, we had just a dismal jobs report last week showing that we're still, I think, 8 million jobs below where we were before the pandemic started. So that's a good indication that we don't have the economic strength to probably get back on board with payments at the levels that were being made prior to the beginning of the pandemic. On the other hand, what I would have loved to see at the onset of the pandemic, and would still like to see now, is that instead of doing these kind of one-size-fits-all solutions like a universal payment pause, we fix IDR, which is supposed to provide the protection that really was needed at this point in time. If we'd had a well-functioning IDR, universal IDR program at the onset of the pandemic, then we wouldn't have had to think about using executive action to intervene. And I think that's the direction that we should be moving.
Mm-hmm. Scott, you represent the companies that the Education Department hires to do the work of collecting student loan payments. There have been over the past year were a lot of sort of starts and stops in terms of when payments were about to restart. Can you talk about what over the past year and so far student loan servicers have been doing to prepare for the restart of payments?
Yeah, and I think, we certainly have been trying to sort of navigate an evolving and dynamic situation, just like everyone else has been, in terms of, as the government decides to pause and then reset the date, and then we have to prepare for that. And, it's very difficult to manage that when we're talking about a system that's servicing tens of millions of borrowers and all of the mechanical moving parts that have to go in to get the program started up again, turn them back off, recode, change things, all that sort of stuff. And I think that's been very challenging. But I guess going back to the question you sort of posed to the other panelists, I think something that we've been recommending for some time is that we don't need to think about this restart as this binary sort of, it's either all on or it's all off. We need to be looking at, and probably what should have been thought about, months ago, is how do we target relief to those people who continue to need it? I mean, certainly there were some borrowers who were not economic. We were all impacted by the pandemic, but some were not economically impacted. And we need to make sure that we're providing relief to the people who need it. And that can be some sort of hybrid beginning of resumption of payment for those who are able, for those who still have distress and want to call in and talk to their servicer and say, I'm still not able to pay right now. Having some tools in our toolkit that we can use for those borrowers is a way to, I used this phrase before, we use related to the pandemic, of flatten the curve of reentry to resumption of payment.
Right. You mentioned sort of how we go about turning on this huge, massive student loan machine that the federal government runs. I think that's something that the Education Department, I think the Biden administration has said it's thinking about how to do that right now. Secretary Cardona mentioned that he wants to have some type of ramp up into student loan payments. I think he wasn't clear about whether that meant a communications ramp up in terms of how you interact with borrowers, or an actual ramp up of people's payment obligations coming due. I think one of the only pieces of guidance we have heard from the Education Department so far is that automatic payments will resume. In other words, if you're a borrower who previously authorized your student loan servicer to automatically debit your bank account each month, that will automatically be turned on. But let's dive into a little more about what this process of turning things back on should look like. Sarah, you alluded earlier to some of the recommendations I think your organization and others have made along these lines. What should the Education Department do right now, or in the coming months, or whenever payments go back on? What should that ramp up look like in your view?
Yeah, so I think there's two pieces there. One that Kat sort of alluded to earlier, which I'll hit on second, but the first is that there are a host of proactive steps that the department can take to sort of help borrowers more smoothly transition back into repayment. The first is to focus on those who were struggling before the pandemic and those who are most at risk of delinquency and default. So including, promising practices, best practices for outreach, measuring those outcomes of that outreach, streamlining processes, providing additional flexibilities to borrowers who exhibit signs of distress after the payment. So it may be additional payment pauses, making it much easier to get into income-driven repayment, at least temporarily. And then just requiring and making sure that that servicers have a skilled workforce in place, that there are resources in the system, whether that's extra folks to answer the phone or sort of whatever that looks like, to have everything in place so that no one falls through the cracks. I think the other important part of this is there are a lot of system fixes that can be undertaken in this moment of a pause, right? Like only 1%-ish of borrowers with federally held loans are currently making payments. And so we have an opportunity, and we have the HEROES Act in place. And the department can use authorities from that during a pandemic, during an emergency. And so something that I've recommended, and I think some other folks have started discussing too, is can we take everyone out of default during this period? Can we sort of make some other reforms to the system that would really help everyone begin repayment with a fresh start?
You mentioned the HEROES Act. That's a 2003 law that gives the Education Department emergency powers during a national emergency, not to be confused with a different HEROES Act that was proposed by House Democrats last year to respond to the pandemic. But Kat, your group has recommended making use of that law and emergency powers that the Education Department has. What in an ideal world, from your perspective, would turning on repayments look like?
Yeah, and just to follow on what Sarah was saying, just thinking about system fixes, I think we're at this moment, especially now since federal borrowers aren't making payments, to really fix the problems that we see in the system. And I know we're all here because I think at some level we all think there are changes that need to be made to the income-driven repayment system. Whether or not we agree on the path to do that, I think now's the time, before we turn on payments for federal student loan borrowers, to think about the ways that we need to change the system. So again, like Sarah was saying, we need to make sure that borrowers aren't in default when we turn payments back on, because we need to just making sure that borrowers are current. We also need to think about, how do we fundamentally think about the IDR system in terms of what do we think about being an affordable payment? Like, just really thinking about, taking into consideration, actual cost of living, and how and how even now what we consider affordable payment is not affordable for many borrowers, as we see in the levels of loan distress. And so before we can even think about are borrowers able to pay, how do we think about fixing the system so that when we do turn on payments, we do have a functioning system that is actually better serving borrowers? And just one thing also to touch on, talking about a somewhat sort of a graded scale to turning on payments, thinking about, do we turn on payments for borrowers who may not be struggling as much right now? Again, going back to this idea of who's struggling. And sometimes I think when we try to target programs too much, we're overly narrow and thinking about how we cast the net in terms of who's struggling. I think sometimes we miss that, there are many borrowers who are struggling in ways that we may not think about. They might not be in delinquency or they might not be in default, but also understanding that income does not equal wealth for all borrowers, understanding that struggling does not necessarily mean that borrowers are in default, but there are many ways that borrowers can be struggling. So even thinking about what it means when we talk about targeting and how we can be actually missing out on many borrowers that we're trying to serve when we're overly narrow in those efforts.
Scott, I want to ask you about something that Sarah mentioned in terms of there being enough resources available to borrowers as the repayments start, in terms of access to people picking up the phone at their servicer or other types of sort of student loan counseling type resources. The department has contracts with student loan servicers. It, during the pandemic, has adjusted how it pays student loan servicers. Before the pandemic, for folks who don't know, there was a scale of how much per loan borrowers, how much per loan account the servicers received, and the idea was to incentivize, pay higher amounts for loans that are current, and in hopes of incentivizing servicers to push borrowers into current status. That changed during the pandemic. The department has been paying servicers a flat fee. How are servicers, how is the industry thinking about the actual resources needed to turn back on repayment, and what are you expecting from the department along those lines?
Yeah, I think, and that's where we do have to be very thoughtful about sort of this process and roadmap, right? And we need to make some decisions well in advance, because not only do you highlight the fact that the department has reduced resources during this period of time, which makes some sense at a certain level because the amount of work that needs to be done on the student loan portfolio on a daily basis has been decreased during this period of time. But if you cut those resources and don't have a plan to ramp up additional investment or resources so we can add customer support staff to handle what will be whatever the transition looks like, hopefully not a big bang, but a transition over time. That's something that needs to be done very thoughtfully in advance, and it can't be done the week before. It can't be done the month before. There needs to be a plan for 2 or 3 months well in advance, because when we're trying to add resources like staff, you have to go through a clearance process with the Department of Education. It's a very cumbersome process to do, and there's a good reason why we do that process, but we need the time in order to accomplish it. And so in many respects, I think that's why we're trying to communicate to the department the urgency of laying out a plan, communicating what that plan is. We have borrowers that want to know what that plan is. And when the servicers don't know, it's difficult to advise with a borrower what that plan is. And that plan, I mean, we are at the stage where we need to know that plan today in order to begin executing against a deadline. And even if the administration or Congress does decide to move the date, no reason not to have the plan in your back pocket for whatever that new date is. So that's something we're really strongly encouraging, that we are really at the time where that plan needs to be developed and communicated, and we're waiting on that.
I want to switch topics a little. I think just about everyone mentioned the design of income-driven repayment, and what that should look like going forward. It seems to me that, having covered student loans for a little while, that one of the political divides in federal student loan policy world isn't necessarily along partisan lines, but is essentially how bullish you are on income-driven repayment and the ability of income-driven repayment to alleviate the burden of student loan repayment, and where student income-driven repayment fits in sort of to the solution to student loan problems. Beth, you've argued IDR is an important safety net to make sure that borrowers don't fall into default or delinquency. The Obama administration made income-driven repayment available to practically everyone, and if your income is low enough under those plans, you could have a $0, as low as the $0 payment. Yet even before the pandemic, setting aside sort of the relief programs we've been talking about, borrowers were still defaulting. I think millions of borrowers were defaulting. There was delinquency. How are you thinking about income-driven repayment as a solution, given the fact that we've had it for some time, but it hasn't reduced defaults and delinquency in the way I think people expected or wanted?
Yeah, I like to say that what we need is for higher education to be less risky for students. We don't need it to be less expensive. We need it to be less risky, meaning people are putting out a ton of money, and that's great when it pays off, but when it doesn't, it's a real problem. The way to do that is with some sort of insurance policy. Income-driven repayment, in theory, does just that. But if you know how income-driven repayment works in practice, it is a patchwork of programs with different parameters and eligibility criteria and different levels of generosity across the programs. It's an absolute mess, even for experts in this field to navigate. So to think that it would effectively create a safety net for borrowers that one, they'd know how to navigate, and two, they would anticipate that it would protect them in the case that they did have trouble, is just sort of crazy. And so I think that the idea of a safety net, of a universal safety net, one that people are automatically enrolled in so that payment is automatically based on your income when you enter repayment, the idea of that is really untested. So we know what we have. It does not work. And I never probably would have imagined or bet that it would if you'd laid out what it looks like now and had me take a guess 5 or 10 years ago. So I think it's IDR is sort of like means testing the bailout, right? I mean, I think that's why this becomes a conservative liberal divide on the issue, is because folks that want to be more efficient with federal spending are saying, sure, let's bail out people, but let's contain that bailout to the people who are truly struggling, and the struggling measured by them having low income relative to the amount that is due on their debt.
Just to follow up on that, the Senator Rubio and others, we heard from Senator Rubio and others have proposed simplification proposals, efforts to simplify the complicated mix of income-driven options that you were just talking about. One of the sticking points, I think, has been whether those simplification efforts lead to a reduction in benefits or less generosity overall for borrowers. Is that the case, or should the programs in some cases become less generous, or how do you think about the sort of benefits that accrue to borrowers under those simplification plans?
Yeah, I'm a little bit agnostic about the level of generosity. I think that there's a very clear case that the structure of the program is wrong, and once we get that fixed, then we can have debates about exactly how generous should be. How much income should you be earning before you have to pay anything on your debt? Things like that. But right now, we can't even have those conversations because the structural problems are just above and beyond everything else. So I think it's fine and in fact, in practice, the only way to get people off of their existing repayment plans and to consolidate into a new universal plan would be to make it more generous. So I think that in practice, that may be what happens. And I think even for people who are more conservatively minded, that would be a reasonable trade-off to eliminate the dysfunction in the current system.
Kat, what is your diagnosis of the dysfunction in the current system that we have in terms of income-driven repayment? What types of changes would you envision?
Well, I think, at least where I stand in terms of affordability, I definitely think we should not be moving backwards in terms of affordability in any way. And so, I don't know if I'm answering your question or another one, possibly at the same time, but even thinking about, is this IDR generous enough for thinking about what the program is? I really think about that we have to think about creating a student loan repayment system where borrowers aren't choosing between financial stability and making their monthly payments. And so really even, I think, like I said earlier, changing what our understanding of what it means to struggle with student debt. And I think that's beyond just delinquency and default, but it's also, we taking into account borrowers' cost of living, even when we're thinking about, so many other costs that people have that we don't take into account. Right now the standard isn't affordable. Anyone who has to pay for childcare, or thinking about or housing right now, I think our standard of affordability is entirely too low, especially when we think about the fact that more than half of all student loan debt is held by households that have zero or negative wealth. So, borrowers might be able to make payments on their loans right now, but are they able to save for retirement? Are they able to buy homes? So really thinking about, do we think it's okay to create an affordability standard where, borrowers are maybe able to pay their loans, and in many cases we see many are not, but that's really all that they can do, and they're hindered in so many other measures of economic mobility. And so I really just think, so I think there's a way to say that, income-driven repayment is a good idea and it's a good thing, but there are definitely fixes to the program that we have to make, so that people essentially aren't, paying on their student debt for, a lifetime, and really understanding how much this debt matters to their economic lives more broadly.
Sarah, you've done some work on how borrowers themselves view barriers in repayment. What's your sense of what those barriers are in relation to enrolling in, staying enrolled in income-driven repayment, and do we have any good data on income-driven repayment? I know that we're just sort of coming to the point where borrowers are eligible to have their loans forgiven under the income-driven repayment programs that have been in place for some time, and we're seeing a few borrowers are receiving that loan forgiveness. What is your sense of the IDR landscape?
Yeah, so I'd love to build on something that Beth said and also on something that Kat said. At my former job and sort of others in the space have also done this, talk to tons of borrowers who are going through, who are struggling to repay their loans, maybe some who are in slightly better financial situations. But what we really heard overwhelmingly is that financial security was the top driver of repayment. So I think first thinking about how to make the plans affordable, to Beth and to Kat's point, is the amount of time and the amount of money you're paying, is that, how do we make that more generous? Like, how do we ensure that those folks at the very bottom of the economic ladder really have a pathway to repayment? And I think this is where some of the equity conversation comes in, is that, right now, 10% or 15% or whatever plan you're on of your income means different things to different people, right? And so there are some people for whom that's going to be a much larger burden. So that's the first thing, making payments more affordable, especially for those at the bottom. The second is that, we've really heard, and research has demonstrated, that growing balances are increasingly a barrier. They're frustrating. They're, make borrowers, sort of feel like they don't want to necessarily engage in a system that just seems to be having their debt growing and growing and growing. But it's also not necessarily like a productive sort of use of resources, right? So how do we help borrowers manage balance growth? How do we organize and structure the system so that that isn't a problem? And then the third is really needing to reduce the administrative burden. Sort of what I always say is IDR is often what we tell people they should be doing, but it's the hardest thing to do. And you don't have to be a behavioral economist to understand that, like, that makes no sense, right? And so making that process a lot easier. And then the fourth thing really gets to your point about data, which is that there actually is very little that we know about IDR, right? We have a lot of qualitative data, we have a little bit of data from the department, but we really don't fully understand how people are using IDR, when they're using it, sort of who's in and who's out at different points in time, right? We have some sort of data about snapshots in time, but what really matters for borrowers' repayment trajectories is the pathway they take. So at what point do they enroll, why, and what are some other issues that they're dealing with in their lives? And some of this data are available and some aren't, and it's getting more data into the hands of advocates, researchers, and policymakers. It should be a top priority.
I want to continue the conversation, but I just want to remind people watching how they can submit a question to our panel. You can submit questions using the live chat function on YouTube or Facebook, or on Twitter using the hashtag BPCLive. And we have a first question coming in. The question is, can you incentivize borrowers to start sending in income-driven repayment applications now, or at least stagger them? I think that raises the question, or the point that you made earlier, Beth, about automating income-driven payments. We know that the Future Act, which Congress passed a year or so ago, would allow better data sharing between the IRS and the Education Department, so that borrowers wouldn't have to annually provide their own income information in order to stay enrolled in income-driven repayment programs. Can you talk a little bit more about the automation part of the income-driven repayment application, and to this person's question about incentivizing borrowers to fill out those applications?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the sort of obvious solution here is like, oh, if somebody's not making any money, you don't charge them for their student loan payments, right? Like everybody across the political spectrum can kind of get behind that idea. But the huge barrier to doing that is that the Department of Education, who is administering student loans, doesn't know how much you're earning. And that's a big part of the problem with IDR, which is that it requires a huge lift by the borrower themselves to go through the process of, I forgot the word of having their income verified so that they can get a reduced payment. So right now there's the legislative restriction on the creation of a data set that would allow for the agencies to talk to each other, that would allow for that level of automation and targeting of benefits. And that's the ban on the unit record system, which I think should be overturned for a number of reasons, but that is a big one. I'd love to see if we could get even like automatic withholding of student loan payments. I once heard Sue Donarski say in a session at Brookings about 1 million years ago that people don't stay up at night worrying about whether their children can pay their taxes, but they stay up at night worrying about whether they can pay their student loans. And the point of what she was saying was she was advocating at that time for a more automated system. And I think that's right. When we know that a payment is going to be automatically based on an affordable level, and again, we can disagree, of course, on what is affordable, but based on some level that someone has deemed affordable, it's much less worrisome, right? We don't worry that Social Security payments are bankrupting us, right? Because they're based on whether or not we're earning and how much we're earning. And so I think the same kind of principles would ease the emotional burden of carrying these debts, along with the elimination of the interest rate, but that's a different issue. And so in terms of incentivizing people to get into IDR, this is kind of what I was talking about before. You can't go into and take a contract that someone has with the Department of Education that says, I'm going to pay back my loans on this terms, and then just swap them out into a new plan. Legally, it just doesn't work. And so what we need to do to change the terms on which people repay their loans, whether it be getting them into IDR or into a new universal IDR program, is you need to put something on the table so that they're willing to consolidate into this new repayment plan, whether it be consolidate or just simply enroll. And so I think the way to do that is, of course, to sweeten the deal a little bit. And we see that happen with things like interest rate deductions for automatic withdrawals and things like that. And so I don't think it's a crazy idea at all to start thinking about ways to start pushing people into getting onto IDR so that the servicers are not slammed when we turn this back on, because I'm very concerned that the servicers are going to be the scapegoat in all of this, and that we point the finger at them a lot and say they're not doing enough to help borrowers. And if we have sort of a train wreck when payments get turned back on, I'm pretty sure those same fingers are going to be pointing at servicers again.
Would you propose, Beth, that the withholding you're talking about be compulsory, like the withholding of income taxes from your paycheck, or would it be a voluntary thing that borrowers would have the ability to opt into or opt out of?
I don't know the answer. I mean, my gut is that I'd like to see it with the ability for borrowers to opt out. And I think that how that actually plays out, we'd have to kind of wait and see. So I'd love it to be an experimental or a pilot sort of program to see, do people hate this? Do they love it? And then we can kind of build up policy from there, because I think it's something that makes sense economically, but it may not make sense in the way that people feel about their loans, which it turns out is a very important aspect that economists often forget to think about.
Kat, do you want to weigh in on what you think servicers should be doing in terms of either incentivizing IDR, or this question of whether IDR should be made automatic and withholding of payments from borrowers automatically?
I'm like, where to start with that? There are a couple places. I do think that I think, like we've said earlier, I think we do need to be thinking about, like, right now, about how are we making sure that borrowers are in IDR. So, whether that date is in September or whether, that's further down the road, we need to be talking to borrowers now about making sure that, that they're enrolled in IDR. If they already are, that they're recertifying their income, so that when payments do get turned back on, that we don't have this situation where borrowers are trying to ensure that they have an affordable payment and they're not ensure that they're enrolled in IDR. But in the same vein, again, going back to even thinking about, before even thinking about turning on payments, just making sure that, again, I will still stand on the fact that I think we need to make sure that we're actually fixing the program before we turn payments back on. And I'm so sorry, Michael. I know you asked two questions in one, and I kind of skipped a thought there. Do you mind repeating the second question?
What should servicers be doing in terms of incentivizing IDR or getting borrowers into IDR? I think Beth alluded to the criticism of servicers that they haven't done that effectively in the past.
Yeah, and I think, and I guess yes, and to add to that, I just think, we shouldn't. I might be one of those people pointing the finger to the servicers, because I do believe it's on the servicers to make sure that if borrowers can be enrolled in IDR and can benefit from an IDR program, they should be making sure that borrowers are in those programs. Or especially if we know that borrowers who have very low incomes can even have $0 payments, but maybe struggling to try to manage a payment that's unaffordable because they're not in a plan. I do think we shouldn't put the onus on borrowers to make sure that they're essentially student loan specialists and know everything about the programs to make sure that they have access to an affordable plan. I think that is part of the reason why we have servicers, to make sure that they can actually help and guide borrowers to make sure that they're in the right repayment plans, and are able to take advantage of and have access to the benefits to which they're entitled. And so that is something I would like to see during this time, is to make sure that we're taking the steps to make sure that borrowers are on track for whenever that point in time is when we turn payments back on.
Scott, I want to turn to you. The fingers were pointed. How are servicers thinking about the return to repayment in the context of getting people either in IDR for the first time or recalculating their payment if their income has changed during the pandemic? I know the industry has long argued with other folks that the system is too complicated, and that is a barrier for borrowers. But if you we're sort of taking all that complication now and consolidating it into even if we do a slow ramp up, I assume that would be several months. Right. Consolidating that amount of complexity into a short period of time. Are servicers prepared to handle that influx of IDR application and IDR requests for a change in monthly payment?
Well, again, I mean, we're still waiting for the department to tell us, how most of these processes are going to work. So until we know what the ramp up is and when stages are going to occur in the resumption, I think it's very difficult for us to lay in a plan until we get guidance from the person who is setting the plan, which is the federal government. I think you do highlight, though, some of the challenges that we have been arguing to fix for many years. I mean, we are provided the toolkit that Congress decides to hand us, and that's from a resource perspective and the amount of staff that we can hire, in terms of the options that we have for flexibility, in terms of making simplification occur. When we talk about the Future Act, which we strongly supported, making sure that we get that ability to simplify the recertification process, whether it's things like also providing sort of, potentially in this period of time, an ability for a borrower to verbally recertify their income for a brief window of time during this period. So we've been advocating pretty strongly for those things, but Congress or the department have got to decide to implement them, because we follow the direction that they provide us on this front. So I think we're going to work within the framework the department gives us, and I think we're going to try to be as best positioned as we can, given the resources and the guidance that hopefully we will get from the department shortly about how they want to manage their student loan portfolio.
We're getting, I'm told, lots of questions on whether IDR is possibly too generous. Some argue that IDR plans provide too generous a benefit to high-income borrowers. Is there any truth to these claims? And how can we ensure that IDR plans help the borrowers who need help the most? Sarah, do you want to weigh in on that? Do you agree with that argument that the generosity of IDR programs, as they're currently construed, is too generous to some borrowers?
I think with all things student loan related, it depends, right? There are some different plans out there. One of them caps the amount of income that your payments are based on and your payments can never rise above what you would pay in the standard 10-year plan, which is the plan that everyone is automatically enrolled in when they leave school and enter work unit. And so that might, allow those with higher incomes to have maybe lower payments relative to their income. But the newest plan doesn't have that cap. So that means everyone, even if you make $1 million, right, a year, you're paying a payment that's relative to your income. So right now, borrowers sort of have this choice and are able to enroll in a plan that sort of matches their repayment goal. So some people may want to pay their loans off faster, which means you're often paying less over time. And I think we forget about that. But some people may have other things going on in their lives and really need to pay the lower amount and be sort of in one of these more generous IDR plans. And so I think we can make fixes to make things more generous for people at the bottom, and we can do things like phase them out toward the top. But there's a host of tools at our disposal if we're going to reform the system. But I did just want to put that out there in response to your question, that I think sometimes it's, we forget to think about what is going on in a borrower's life and some of the choices that they might need to be making behind the scenes.
Kat, I think that's something you alluded to earlier in talking about whether income-driven repayment, monthly payments reflect a borrower's true economic circumstance. What changes would you propose along those lines? Is it different, a different formula?
And so I think what I was alluding to is even thinking of probably the opposite. I know this. The question is it too generous? I was actually thinking the inverse, and thinking of how we think of income thresholds and what income actually means, especially when we start calculating and thinking about, student debt is disproportionately held by borrowers who come from low wealth households, especially when we think about the racial disparities in the student debt crisis, and thinking about, wealth disparities, especially between Black and white households, Black and Latino households, and thinking about the ways that income doesn't necessarily mean wealth. And so someone can be a higher earner, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other economic circumstances that actually don't make the burden of student debt disproportionately weigh on certain communities. And so I think income is not always a sole factor of measuring actually someone's financial or economic hardship. And so I sometimes think in an effort to overly narrow who should be entitled to relief, I think many times we can stand to actually exclude many borrowers that we are trying to help. So borrowers who come from low wealth households or low wealth communities, and making sure that student debt is not just like another barrier to economic mobility that we're creating.
Beth, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I did. I think that my guess is what the viewers were alluding to with that suggestion was the issue of those who go on to get very large graduate student loans and then will ultimately have those forgiven, even though they're a relatively high earner. And so the way that this system is designed right now is if I'm in graduate school, there can hit a point where based on some prior knowledge of what I'm going to do after school, I can start borrowing and realize that the next dollar that I borrow, I'm never going to have to pay back. And so that's really problematic in terms of creating the appropriate incentives for people to borrow exactly what they need. And so when we have an income-based repayment system that treats undergraduate borrowing, which is essentially limitless, to undergraduate borrowing with the same treatment, then I think we get a lot of the unsavory outcomes that a lot of people are probably referring to, which is like these high earners who have extremely high balances from going to elite or expensive graduate institutions who are then getting large sums of forgiveness. So, I do think that's a problem. But I think that more likely the solution is going to come from putting caps on graduate student borrowing than it is going to come from huge changes in the way that we allocate income-driven repayment.
Is it okay if I just chime in on chiming in on one of Beth's points? And I'm sorry, missing that part of the question. But even thinking about high balance borrowers who may have gone to graduate school and who might have higher debt balances, and people thinking again, are we forgiving people who went to grad school and have high levels of debt? I think a lot of times we also have to think about more and more people need credentials to do their jobs. So when we think about, social workers in nearly every state need a master's degree to do their work, or, many states require librarians to have master's degrees. Many teachers have graduate degrees. So even thinking about how we're demanding more and more education for the people who serve in our communities, and then also understanding that, not necessarily everyone who goes to grad school or even has a high balance is necessarily, racking up that to, becoming a doctor or lawyer. Not saying that they're any less deserving of, affordable repayment plans, but also really thinking about how we set that narrative of, who has debt.
So, Michael, I think, another thought here. I mean, I think this highlights that we can sort of on the back end fight a lot about sort of, well, what is exactly the calculus, right? Sort of who should get it, when should they get it? But at some point, we probably need to step back and look at the bigger picture is, what does it tell us about sort of the system that we have working when half of the portfolio is in an income-driven plan, meaning they are not financially in a position to pay back the money that was borrowed? Does that tell us that we are getting the value out of what is being paid for? And certainly, I always come at it from, that's a lot of that's sort of political discussion, but we have to operate in a world of opportunity costs, right? Every dollar that is spent, and if we're estimating that on whether it's on defaults and whether it's on income-driven forgiveness, that the taxpayer is going to pony up $600 billion in extra subsidy into the program to help manage the existing portfolio today. That's not tomorrow's portfolio. I think we really have to question, are we, number one, getting value and price from colleges? Are people graduating into an economy where that decision was worth it? And in some ways, income-driven repayment is a solution, but it's a symptom. And how do we create a better system so we can reduce borrowing or better target programs in terms of grant programs that reduce the need to borrow rather than coming in 10, 15 years later and how to fix a system that we broke a decade ago, and those borrowers are now living with that. those choices.
We only have a few more minutes left. I thought maybe we could end with a quick speed round. Can everyone give us their top 1, 2 quick, easy fix? Not easy. Their most important fixes that they would make to this current student loan program, whether that's IDR or outside of IDR. Sarah, do you want to go first?
Sure. So the first one for me is really unsexy. It's just making sure we have the right data to be making evidence-based policy. And the second is one we haven't talked about yet, which is just the need to think about the intersection of student loans and other social safety net benefits and sort of the wider variety of families' economic realities and how those things interplay with each other.
Scott?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all agree on like simplification of the IDR, getting from 5 plans down to 1. I think a lot of people's, those IDR can work very well. I think the real challenge we see with borrowers is that they're confused about which one they might be eligible for because there are 5 and it sort of depends. And so trying to explain that to someone is very challenging. So I think simplification and also I think looking at how do we also potentially deal with the perception as borrowers are in income-driven repayment, and they don't see their balances decline, which is how Congress structured it. How do we address that concern of borrowers not feeling like they're making progress?
Beth, what are the top 2 on your list?
Okay, wipe away the current slate of income-driven repayment systems and put in place one single system that is the default repayment option and allow people to make repayments through income withholding. And then if I had a magic wand and I didn't have to deal with any sort of actual on-the-ground implementation problems, I would say we need to stop making loans to people that we know are going to be unaffordable for them to repay.
Kat, the magic wand has been passed to you. What are your top 2?
And there are only 2. Okay, this is really hard. For the sake of time, I think, broadly before we turn back on payments, we fix the IDR system. So again, making payments more affordable for borrowers and really changing what our definition of affordable is. And that also includes, again, talking about a magic wand, how do we do this and not have non-amortizing loans? And then again, I'm already at 2, and I know we're at time, so I'll stop there. But I think my list definitely goes on, but I'll stop with the first 2 that came to mind.
All right. Well, thank you all for a great discussion. I really enjoyed this, and it was great to hear all of your perspective. Thanks again to the Bipartisan Policy Center for putting this on, and thanks for all of you for watching.